pursue careers in tech, law, policy, and entrepreneurship.
When I started, Silicon Flatirons was an experiment. It was me and some students putting on a few conferences without really a plan where it was going to go. My initial motivation was because I didn't believe you could have impactful policy discussions unless you brought people together across different disciplines. Silicon Flatirons Center has given me an image of what a team can look like.
And it really made Boulder into a location that was seen as on par with DC or Silicon Valley and other places around the country that are leading thought centers in the field of law and tech.
What's excited me the most is to see it grow, but not only just grow in terms of the number of people attending our different events, but growing in terms of the different areas that we have been involved in.
When a law student says, I've got a passion for understanding the intersection of technology and law, but where do I get started with that? What Flatirons provides is a position to actually go angle for a job during their second summer, where they're actually going to get to be involved directly in setting tech policy or in advocating around tech policy.
The Silicon Flatirons community is incredibly unique in how close it is and how people are willing to band together to move conversations forward.
It's one thing to be sitting in a room by yourself reading articles, and it's very much another thing to actually be sitting at a table talking to somebody about their daily experiences of trying to navigate compliance with a complex new law.
We're all a community of friends who enjoy spending time with one another.
The people we engage with through here are very much thinkers and thought leaders, so they're contributing to whether it's our strategy or our resources in really meaningful ways.
Silicon Flatirons has changed the dynamic between Colorado law and the surrounding community as well as the national community.
One of the great joys of my profession is talking to people who are really early in their careers and helping them get excited about what you're excited about.
We get the types of people in the room that everyone thinks should be talking to one another, but often are not.
I get to work with students, I get to work with attorneys, I get to work with policymakers at the intersection of all these issues.
Students are first and foremost, so everything is generally student-driven.
And it is centered around people who are wanting to engage with students.
I've seen students come into Silicon Flatirons just having a little interest in it, in year one, and by year three, they're passionate about it and they found their career.
And I think that that really helps the standing of the university more broadly, and it also attracts lots of really interesting and talented speakers.
I think what I'm excited to see happen with Silicon Flatirons in the next 5, 10, even 20 years is for it to blend continuity with change.
It's not enough to have smaller conversations anymore. The world is all connected, and Silicon Flatirons is going to reflect that global nature of the internet as we move forward into 20 years in the future.
I hope it continues to operate with the same spirit of experimentation, of adventure, of seeking out new challenges that we've done over the first 20 years.
Hi, welcome everyone. It's so great to see everybody here tonight. I just want to give a quick housekeeping note. My name is Vanessa. I'm the Senior Events Manager for Silicon Flatirons. Tonight's program is in the Zoom webinar format, so if you're in the audience, we cannot see or hear you. We will have Q&A available. Please give us your questions in that Q&A function window. You can upvote something that is particularly interesting to you. And without further ado, I'll hand things over to Brad Bernthal.
Thank you, Vanessa. As we're getting going, maybe a quick mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2. Brad Feld, how you doing over there?
3, 4, 3, 4.
We will be right back to you. And Anno, I see that you're having trouble opening your video. Let's check on the audio. Anno, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Very good. Okay, start my video. Looks good. Here I am.
All right.
Great to see you guys.
I'll turn it over to you momentarily. Let me make a few welcome comments to everybody. My name is Brad Bernthal. I am the director of the Entrepreneurship Initiative at Silicon Flatirons Center. I'll get to do a lot of the talking tonight, but I want to underscore that this is a team effort that makes events like tonight possible. You already met Vanessa Koppel. I want to thank her Amy Stepanovich, Nate Mariotti, Heather Martin, Sarah Schnickeren, and Catherine Coble, our team here at Silicon Flatirons. We operate on your support. Thanks to our supporters for making this possible. They are listed on our website. Encourage you to check that out at some point and then give them a virtual hug at some moment. If you or your company or firm would be interested in getting involved as a supporter, please follow up with us. And if you like what you hear tonight, or even if you don't like what you hear tonight, I will encourage you to rejoin us on November 16th. That is our annual entrepreneurship conference this year. And that will focus on private-public partnerships with a specific focus on how those partnerships have played an important role in the state of Colorado's pandemic response, something that Brad's been involved in, and I'm actually going to raise as part of our Q&A tonight. The courtroom is filling up virtually, and we're going to have a full house, metaphorically speaking at least. It's going to be a very stimulating conversation about economic geography, which is the relationship between factors of production and space. And specifically, tonight's discussion is about startup activity and space, in particular, geographic location. Silicon Flatirons has had dual status on this topic as both participant and observer over the years. We've had discussions on this topic going back to at least 2008, and really excited to be discussing Brad Feld and Ian Hathaway's new book, The Startup Community Way, tonight. A couple acknowledgements and announcements before we get underway. And Vanessa, if you will, let's roll out tonight's poll. While Vanessa's doing that, I will give you the question here, which is, if you had a choice, in which newscaster's voice would you most like to hear tonight's acknowledgements and announcements? Walter Cronkite, most trusted man in America. Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Ron Burgundy, Scotchy, Scotch, Scotch. Colin Yost, Michael Che, or no voice, I prefer to get news from a mime. Go ahead, enter your polling preference at this point. Vanessa,
we have 62% reporting. The votes are rolling in. It's kind of neck and neck right now, but Ron Burgundy has a slight lead over Walter Cronkite.
Appropriate for our times. Appropriate for our times. All right. Well, I will check with Will Farrell, and I will bring him back to do the acknowledgements and announcements for the next time. But here's where we're in for. A couple things. First of all, I want to highlight Silicon Valley Bank, which donated $500 for tonight to buy $500 worth of books for students. So the Startup Community Way is going to be going out to several students for free. Thank you to Silicon Valley Bank for that. Second is for students, 2 announcements. One is the Pandemic Innovation Competition, where you'll be tackling a solution to an industry sector upended by the pandemic. We have extended that deadline to Friday. I encourage you to look at the Silicon Flatiron Center's website to participate in that. And the new Venture Challenge kickoff, this is, to my mind, the best thing we've got going at CU with respect to entrepreneurship. We kicked that off on October 28th. Also great for anybody at CU, student, faculty, staff, get involved. One more announcement, actually 2 more. Jacqueline Hester. I don't know if Jacqueline's on right now, but Jacqueline is a CU alumna and has recently been made a partner by the Foundry Group. To my knowledge, that is the first person who has recently come through the CU program and made the status of partner at a major venture capital fund, which as a professor, I am extremely proud and want to congratulate Jacqueline on that achievement. And finally, CU and the city of Boulder are on traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. No matter where you are zooming in from tonight, want to pay our respects and celebrate those nations and their people as we get underway. This is the part where I would typically stop and encourage you to meet someone around you, but score another one for the virus. We ain't going to be able to do that tonight, but appropriate for a discussion about community. We have a reception afterwards, and I encourage you to stick around after the Q&A and join us in the Air Meets, which is kind of a cool virtual billboard. Experiment with it and see how it works. Here's where we're going tonight in 4 parts. First, We have a very special guest introduction. Second, I'm going to do an interview with Brad until about 6:40 p.m. Third, Q&A with those of you on the call tonight. We'll do that until 7. And then fourth, we'll do a reception through Air Meets. With no further ado, a special introduction from Berkeley, California. Professor Anno Saxenian is a highly accomplished scholar in the area of economic geography. Her books include Regional Advantage and The New Argonauts, which are both fantastic. Here is what Brad and Ian wrote in their book about Professor Saxenian's work. They said, quote, "Our thinking is influenced by the economic geographer Anno Saxenian. We believe Saxenian's book, Regional Advantage, is probably the most important writing in the modern era on what makes a particular region consistently more innovative and entrepreneurial than another. It is an honor to turn the introduction over to Professor Saxenian. Anno, thanks for being with us.
Wow, thanks, Brad. I don't get that kind of introduction very often. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really delighted that I have the opportunity to say a few words about Brad and Ian's work and about economic geography more broadly, and how it's evolving with their help, I would say. Ever since the economist Alfred Marshall wrote about agglomeration economies in the early 20th century, scholars have understood and recognized that there are benefits to firms from co-locating in the same place. And they have, there have been many, we have seen sort of repeated, from the rug makers in Georgia to the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. We have these clusters throughout economic history. Now, Marshall's theory had 3 components to it. It had one to explaining why similar firms might want to cluster, what the advantage was. First was to share a skill base, that there are advantages to having a highly skilled skill base concentrated so that firms can hire and fire and move, more quickly. The second was shared suppliers, shared input providers. And then the third was the most, I think, interesting, which he said, the secrets of the industry are in the air. Okay, now in these, agglomerations, these clusters, these districts, industrial districts is what he called them. Well, what does it mean to say the secrets of the industry are in the air? It's a really interesting question. And I think for economists, it's actually a hard one because it's hard to measure. It's hard to track and measure secrets of an industry. So I think it's been reduced to information exchange, which is not bad. I think it's a good start. But I don't think it tells the whole story. And this is where I want to sort of go with this set of comments. So when I wrote Regional Advantage, I was comparing Silicon Valley to the Boston Route 128 area. And I highlighted the organization of the firms in those 2 regions. And that essentially Boston, which was older and more established and seemed to be the place that would, of course, perform better, was organized around a small number of vertically integrated, what I call autarkic firms. So information flowed internally within these firms, but rarely between them. Whereas in Silicon Valley, you had a very decentralized structure with lots of entrepreneurs, lots of experimentation, open boundaries across the firms. And what I argue is that organizational structure enhanced the community because individuals, entrepreneurs could learn more quickly by interacting with one another. I also was clear that this was about a social structure, not just about individual actors in economic exchange, which is what economists needed to do because they write about individuals and firms. But there was a social structure, and I talked about community, I talked about a lot of things, but I don't think I specified it very well. In subsequent years when people, I gave a lot of talks because everybody wanted to become the next Silicon Valley. And I would say things like, well, open boundaries between firms and other institutions, so universities, banks, venture investors, all of the law firms, making a community. And then when I wrote The New Argonauts, which actually looks at the replication of entrepreneurial clusters in other parts of the world, I talked about the way these clusters were linked and the importance of linking clusters like in Taiwan to Silicon Valley, because Taiwan became highly specialized in manufacturing the things that Silicon Valley was producing. Now, of course, it's China, India in software. So one of the things that I like most about this book, about Brad and Ian Hathaway's book, and what their project more broadly, is their focus on the social and on the non-quantifiable aspects of clusters, of agglomerations, and the fact that they actually call them communities, because I think that's exactly right. And a community says a lot more than the economist language. So just to back up a bit, when I started writing, Silicon Valley was the only one. Then you saw the emergence of Seattle. Oh, and then you saw maybe Austin, Texas, or whatever. The thing that just really impressed me when I was introduced to Boulder and the community in Boulder, Brad gets credit for inviting me to Boulder to give a talk, I think maybe about a decade ago. And I met Brad at that time. And the thing that impressed me was, number one, they were not trying to be Silicon Valley. Number two, they were very open to learning from their own experience and from other experiences. And number three, and I really think this is important, what they write and what they preach, or whatever you want to call it, is based on practice. It's not based on academic theory. And I think there's, of course, an important role for scholars, but it's critical that we hear from practitioners. And I think I'm learning a lot from these practitioners. And there's a role for all of us. There's an important sort of lesson for all of us from what Brad is doing in both, in his first book, building an entrepreneurial ecosystem, and then in the second one with Ian on evolving the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I think the thing I like the most about this is that you have one book in 2012 and one book in 2020, and there's evolution. They're learning. This framework has evolved. It's gotten more sophisticated. They've learned lessons from evolutionary theory. They have taken their own experience and brought it to bear in this work. And I hope that my hope for the future is that scholars will learn from this, that we can now take what's been learned in places like Boulder, which is a very impressive place. I returned to Boulder a couple of years ago and had another conversation with Brad, and it's always stimulating, with both Brads, actually, come to think of it. It's always a stimulating experience, and I think there's so much to learn from what they're learning. So I'm kind of happy to hand this over back to Brad Bernthal and to you for a conversation about entrepreneurial ecosystems, really from the bottom up. Okay, this is not from the lens of a scholar. It's not from the top down, all these governments trying to create Silicon Valley. This is really from the bottom up. And I think it's really important to our collective futures. So I'll hand it back to you, Brad.
Anna, really fantastic to have your comments. Thank you for joining us. And Brad Feld, you did not know that Anna was going to be coming in tonight. Let me just start by asking any reactions to Anna's comments before we get the interview underway.
Well, a couple of things. One is super psyched, Anna, to see you. If people have read the first Startup Communities book, and of course, Brad, you called out some of the comments. There were two people who wrote books that and thinkers that really meaningfully influenced the way I approached the first book. Anna was one of them. Richard Florida was the other. And I categorize them effectively as my intellectual heroes as I started to try to put together this first book. And it wasn't the first book I'd written, so I knew how challenging it was to write a book that would be accessible. With the book, I was trying to create a new phrase, startup communities, which I didn't really consciously think that it would have as much sort of pervasiveness and stickiness as it's had in the last 8 years since the book came out. But I remember, Brad Bernthal, a conversation we had And for people that don't know it, there's, I think it's chapter 3 in Startup Communities, was largely written by Brad Bernthal. And what it was originally was, I'd asked you to write a foreword. And, you wrote, a thing, we went back and forth on it. And I kind of looked at it, I'm like, this is such a good consolidation of sort of a basis for them building the book on. That this is not a foreword, this is a chapter. And that's a chapter that mentions sort of this other work. And it was done in a way, like, I don't think I could have written that chapter in 2012 as effectively as you did. And, it just sort of ties these pieces together. The reason I'm saying it this way is not to shine on Brad or not to shine on Anna. It's part of the thought process in trying to put these things together, in my own experience, is an iterative one with other people. And they often don't get enough credit in a book. You read a book, you read a business book, you read a nonfiction book, and it's got lots of little sections and quotes from people and references to things. But you don't really know how much influence that had on the author, not even in the specific writing, but on where the thought process went. As someone who lived in Boston between 1983 and 1995, Regional Advantage came out in 94, I think. So right at the tail end of when I was at Boston. I was at MIT. I did do but not finish a PhD program in management of innovation. And so when Regional Advantage came out, it wasn't a book that I sort of stumbled upon a decade later. It was something that I read in that time period because it was in that sort of mix of the stuff I had. When I moved to Boulder in 1995, I don't know that I was carrying around the lessons from Boston and Silicon Valley, but then investing and spending a ton of time in both places between 1994, really, when I started spending meaningful time in the Bay Area, and then maybe 2000 and, I spent meaningful time in the Bay Area probably till about 2015, but really significant time till about 2006. I was there 3 out of 4 weeks a month, 1 to 3 days a week. So it's just immersed in that, but still with this very deep connection to Boston and investments and network in Boston. Anna's book came alive. Like, I saw it play out in my own investing experience, my own experience with what happened during the rise of the internet bubble in those two cities, and then what happened after the collapse of the internet bubble, and then what happened again, sort of with the emergence of what was labeled by Tim O'Reilly Web 2.0. So I'll sort of end with the comment of, it's just powerful to me because it was so foundational. And in some ways, I feel like I've probably, like even just talking in this moment, in the new book, in the Startup Community Way, Ian and I tried harder to give credit to a lot of the thinking that we built upon. He's a researcher, he's an economist, he's also an entrepreneur, but he comes from that background. So the book is more naturally documented than the first book. But I even feel then I've done short shrift for both Anna and Richard in terms of how it's impacted me. And there's something interesting to do with that. So if nothing else, Anna, you probably inspired me by showing up today to weave you in and some of that thinking and some of my own thinking into a couple of blog posts going forward at a meta level. One of the things I've been playing around with since Ian and I wrestled through this book was using the metaphor of complex adaptive systems and the idea of complexity theory to explain how startup communities grow, develop, and evolve. The COVID crisis is the collision of multiple complex systems, right? It's a collision of the health crisis. If you read my blog, you saw this post at the end of March. It's a collision of a health crisis that generated an economic crisis. We had a very strong economy in the US prior to COVID, lots of inequities, but a very strong economy. So we wouldn't have an economic crisis in the absence of a health crisis. That is generating a profound mental health crisis, not new, but one that's now very visible because of the dynamics around all of the stresses that COVID is creating, not just around the health crisis, but also around another crisis, a racial equity crisis that's being amplified by all this. Racial equity crisis is not new. It's been around for over 400 years. But again, these are complex systems, and how they interact is so hard to define deterministically, which is something that governments want to do, politicians want to do, big businesses want to do, even academics want to do, nonprofit. Like, everybody wants to create deterministic dynamics. And so much of what we deal with as human beings doesn't function that way. And even, again, the meta is even my own learning and evolution, as Anno points out, is, as a practitioner's experience, it's a result of a complex system, not a result of a deterministic study that had an endpoint that quantified a bunch of logical stuff. So there's something in there for me to do with that hopefully will pop out in additive ways. But thank you for being here. Thank you for inspiring it. And thank you for being such a base of my own thinking. And I would just say for everybody, as a good book salesman always should, if you haven't read Anna's book, Regional Advantage, it is a must read for anyone interested in this topic, which presumably is everyone in this call. And the New Argonauts is an extension of that. But that first book is so important because it is one of the foundational pieces.
Well, I recognize that not everyone who's joining has had a chance to read the book yet. So I'd like to start, Brad, with some of the foundational concepts. And in particular, you and Ian write that, quote, the most valuable relationships for startups, especially early in a company's life, are local. While it's useful for entrepreneurs and other startup community participants to engage with people in other places, local relationships are the most valuable. Can you explain a little bit more about that? For a startup, say here in Boulder, why is a local relationship arguably going to be more important than, say, an interaction with someone in Boston, the Valley, New York, or elsewhere?
Yeah, it's particularly interesting to reflect on that today. The book came out in July. We finished it in February. We finished the final draft and all the publisher edits at the end of April. So we were able to sneak a couple of references into COVID into the final book. But when we finished the book in February, if you had told us that the whole business world would be operating remotely using video conferencing and all companies would have to function in a distributed manner. Now, I, as somebody who loves to not travel anymore, having traveled, 75% of my working time for 20 something years, someone who's very, very comfortable with remote relationships and working remote. You probably, actually, even in January pre-COVID, I dropped a couple of hints in some blog posts about the future of work as distributed. I think that was a post I wrote, sort of amplifying that this was not anticipating COVID, but this was a phenomena that was building. And we just accelerated that by 5 years, right? So it wasn't that this is a new thing that emerged. It was a thing that was happening. And in 6 months, we did 5 years of acceleration. When we wrote the book, we weren't really thinking about that. And so it's interesting to now reflect on it. One of the things that is so important about local dynamics, which is also part of the book, is this notion of topophilia, which is a word that I learned from John Hickenlooper. And, John was, in addition to being governor of Colorado for 8 years, he was an entrepreneur. And those of you that like microbrews and don't know John's story, he essentially was one of the founders of the microbrewery industry. And as an entrepreneur, John had a hyper-local business, but he was connected to an emerging business ecosystem that was larger than just Denver because of the microbrewery industry and how it expanded. When I heard this word from him, topophilia, and I'm from Texas, so I can't say topophilia, which I know that people from other parts of the country might. I've been corrected several times. I'm like, I just can't say it that way. It's not a topographical map, it's a topographical map, but that'll keep the word in your mind. Topography, it's love of place. And it's such a profound word because the reason that people engage in a startup community is because they love the place they're at. And if you think about startup communities that have grown and developed and evolved over many years, topophilia is an essential component of it. So I've lived in Boulder, I've lived in Colorado now for 25 years. I split my time now between Boulder and Aspen. And in that 25, bye Anna, it's great to see you.
Great to see you too. We'll keep in touch.
Please, and thanks so much for just showing up and saying nice things.
Of course.
I'll send the check later.
Sorry.
No, all good. So this notion of love of place is so powerful, because when I moved to Boulder 25 years ago with Amy, we moved here randomly. Many people have heard this story, but we knew one person, a guy named Vern Harnish, and he moved away 6 or 12 months later. And so we didn't move to Boulder for work. We didn't move to Boulder for family. We didn't move to Boulder for school. We didn't move to Boulder for a job. We didn't move to Boulder for friends. We moved to Boulder because we were looking for the place we wanted to live, and we wanted to build the rest of our life. Amy's from Alaska. I'm from Dallas. Boston was very good to both of us, but it wasn't home. I don't like the Bay Area. I couldn't have described why in 1995. I can today, but I couldn't have described why. I love Seattle. Amy grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Alaska. She's had enough of maritime weather for the rest of her life. And so living in Seattle wasn't really a choice. 6 months into being in Boulder, we knew this was home for the duration. I still didn't really know anybody, but we decided to build our life around being in Boulder. And of course, that started to evolve into getting to know people, getting to know other businesses. And at some point relatively early, I decided I wanted to find some people like me who are entrepreneurs. And so I essentially reached out to a lawyer and reached out to a banker that a friend of mine introduced to me that didn't live in Boulder anymore, but had lived in Boulder, a woman named Jenna Matthews. And they sent physical letters to people. I basically said, send letters to people who are your clients who own businesses. And from that emerged like my first connection with the Boulder startup community. And people today that came to the first meeting that I hosted, which was at the Boulder Colorado, and it was an introductory meeting for something that ended up being the Colorado chapter of Young Entrepreneurs Organization, included people like Tim Enwall, multi-time entrepreneur, well-known probably to this crowd, currently running Misty Robotics. Paul Barbarian, who at the time was running a company called Link VTC that he'd founded with Jim Legiel and a couple of other people. Joel Daly, who was one of Paul's partners. I believe Ryan Martins or Tim Enwall, I can't remember which one were there, that kind of a thing. Like, these are still people who 25 years later continue to play leadership roles in the Boulder startup community. And that connective tissue between those people, and then this notion of inclusivity, which is part of the Boulder thesis, that circle expanding very quickly, engaging anyone who wanted to engage. When I think about my Boston-based network, I have a deep Seattle-based network because I did a lot of work with my first company with Microsoft. I developed a very deep Bay Area network. I have a deep LA network. But my love of Boulder has a different effect on that network and my relationship to those people and the proximity that I have to them. Let me add COVID into this. One of the things, if Anna was here, she'd be smiling. The second book, and she pointed to this, one of the important things is connections across communities, not just within communities. Kauffman Foundation did a study a number of years ago. People have asked me for it. I can't find it. I should probably go hunt it down with somebody from Kauffman. That did a nationwide study of business activity in the US, and it showed that the cities that were the most healthy over a period of time were the ones that had the most inputs and outputs of people. So the most movement. If you just had people going to a place, the place stagnated. If you had people just leaving the place, you got Detroit, or you got Philadelphia, or big important cities that had their collapse because of whatever historically had happened around their industrialization and their lack of innovation as cities. And so this notion of connectivity is important. And this is where COVID comes in. We can accelerate the health and growth of the startup communities, and we can accelerate entrepreneurial activity through the notion of virtual connections. Because previously you had to invest a lot more time and energy to go to another place and to engage with people. And yet, if you think about the Boulder startup community today, with all of the connections that people have in Boulder with each other, but then all of the connections that the people in Boulder have outside of Boulder, all the people coming to Boulder every year, all the people leaving Boulder every year, like that connective tissue, which we can now leverage virtually, is very profound. We did not get that very captured in the book. Again, we were able to sort of hint at it a few places, but I don't think, by the way, there's going to be a third book in this series. I'm not really into trilogies. But if there was an extension of this thinking to build on that thought, Brad, it would be sort of the importance of that topophilia, that love of place, the commitment of energy, time, money over a long period of time to that place you love in building the startup community, but then the connective tissue to other places, which, by the way, just as the final thought on this, when I moved from Boston to Boulder, I brought a lot of connective tissue from Boston. And for people in the Boulder startup community, they can still see threads of that woven through different things and different relationships that people have, not just from me, but from other people that came from different places and then brought that connective tissue.
So building on that sense that geography and being local is one of the organizing mechanisms for the connective tissue, but there's others that are accelerating in terms of possibilities. Maybe you could put that in terms that you and Ian use in the book, defining a startup community, and you distinguish that from an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I'd welcome discussion about the relationship between those two.
So we wrestled with this for a while in the book because I was hell-bent on having a chapter around this, which we ended up getting and coming up with. The phrase startup communities didn't exist before 2012. There were other phrases that people used. They used, research clusters, innovation, this. I'm not sure what I don't have in my head what Anno used in regional advantage, but there was like a bunch of language, much of it academic or consulting oriented language that entrepreneurs didn't relate to. And entrepreneurial ecosystem was one of those phrases. Every now and then it would show up, but it was so mushy and so hard to grab onto. So in creating this concept of a startup community, I really wanted it to be the core, the nucleus of the entrepreneurial activity in a place. And I wanted it to be a conceptual framing that entrepreneurs related to and embraced, knowing that all the other actors in the system, government, university, big businesses, nonprofits, et cetera, would have different framing and different things around it and could use different language. But I wanted there to be a thing that entrepreneurs owned at the core. Ian, when we started working on this book, again, Ian's a researcher and an economist. He probably read 100 papers that had come out since startup communities about startup communities or entrepreneurial ecosystems. And a lot of the entrepreneurial ecosystem stuff was frameworks for building an entrepreneurial ecosystem. And there was some language around innovation ecosystems. There's great research from a team at MIT and from a department at MIT that has sort of emerged around innovation ecosystems, different than entrepreneurial ecosystems, but adjacent and very complementary. There were a number of people and a number of consulting firms that were trying to co-opt this language and say, hire me to come help you, government to do this entrepreneurial ecosystem thing. And as Ian read through all of this, and we looked at all of these frameworks, and thankfully he read the papers, and then he would sort of, snip out the abstract and the one picture that he wanted me to take a look at, and we'd sort of go through it that way versus me having to drag my ass through all these papers. The consistent thing consistent thing was that none of this was actionable. That none of these frameworks actually gave someone a way to actually build and develop a startup community. It was much more of a looking in the rearview mirror, categorizing existing stuff that you had, organizing different actors into different frames of reference. So that, plus then something that bugged the shit out of me, which is the conflation of 4 words: startup communities being a phrase, and entrepreneurial ecosystem. So through these papers, you'd see startup ecosystem, entrepreneurial community. Just the lack of precision around the language made me crazy. Because again, I wanted to give, in my language, as an entrepreneur, I wanted there to be this focal point that entrepreneurs owned versus all the other actors in the system owned. And so we ended up in the book defining a startup community as the nucleus, an entrepreneurial ecosystem as a bigger thing around it, both important. There is one goal and one goal only of the startup community, and that's to help entrepreneurs succeed. That's it. That is the only goal of the startup community. The actors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem often have other goals than just helping entrepreneurs succeed. By the way, the actor's government or university, when it engages with the startup community, it often is trying to help entrepreneurs succeed. So it's not that it's antithetical to it, but that's not the only goal. And I'll give an example. I've talked to way too many people in government in the last 8 years. I shouldn't say it that way. I've talked to many people in government in the last 8 years. I have lots of friends in economic development groups within city, state, and federal and international government, country level governments. And I've had lots of good conversations that have been prompted by the first book and now being prompted by the second book. And in those conversations, I often ask the person, what are your goals? Like, what are you trying to do? Like, just list a few of them out. And they list a few because I'm trying to make sure I know what the goals contemporaneously of economic development in a city, state, federal, country level government is. Invariably, I get a list because they know what their jobs are. They have 5 initiatives that they're going after. Almost 100% of the time, one of those on their list is to create more jobs. Almost 100% of the time. I can't think of a place or conversation where that wasn't on the list. I'm sure there was one, but I can't think of one. So when I say to them, create more jobs, okay, have you ever gone to an entrepreneur and said, hi, I'm here to help you create more jobs? And very few of them had ever had that conversation that directly with an entrepreneur. It's one of their goals in their work. I said, well, here's what a good entrepreneur would say. An experienced entrepreneur would say, I don't need your help, Mr. or Mrs. Government person, creating more jobs. That's what I do. I am an entrepreneur. My business creates jobs. So you don't have to do anything to help me create jobs. Now, I need a lot of other help around attracting the right kind of people, getting the right kind of people educated, having the right kind of incentive for people to move to this city to be here. There's lots of other things you can help, but I'm the one that's actually creating the jobs, not you. And so what I'm trying to do in some of those, or what I've tried to do in some of those conversations, and I think Ian does it very, very well in his work. He's at Techstars now, leading sort of the initiatives that they have around startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystem development. In that, it's focusing all of the actors on 2 things. One is, if you're trying to engage with the startup community, focus on that one goal, which is to help entrepreneurs succeed. If you're focusing on the entrepreneurial ecosystem, make sure you're being clear about what your outcomes are and where the inputs to those outcomes are coming from. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And look, we can see it in Colorado, just locally in government, right? Colorado is now a massive attractor of companies from out of state, second offices, remote workers. We've got a couple of people on Betsy Markey's team who are outstanding at Office of Economic Development, who are outstanding at this at the state level. And you're seeing companies come and especially fast-growing companies come to the Front Range and a little bit in rural Colorado now as well, and establish, 100, 200, 400, 500 person offices. Some of that is a government motion of trying to help attract, pick a big company or pick a company that's fast growing like Slack or something else. But then if you look at other things that are happening, it's happening independent of the government. An employee from a company, Twitter buys a company, GNIP, to start up locally. People from Twitter come and visit the Twitter office in Colorado, and they think to themselves, wow, Colorado's pretty cool. Twitter now has an internal policy where people can work anywhere they want. And they also have a policy that is, there's a question as to whether Twitter will ever go back to their offices. I'm not going to prognosticate on that. It's, who knows where this goes. But they've been very clear, like people can work from wherever they want. Well, you have this influx of people from other parts of the country who are like, I love to ski. Why am I here? Why aren't I living in Carbondale? Why aren't I living in outside of pick your ski resort? Why aren't I living in Denver and it's only 90 minutes away instead of 4 hours away? And you see that kind of motion, which is not something that's organized by the actor, but that's bringing more jobs to Colorado, again, linked to that activity. So that's the reason all those pieces fit together. There's a few more nuances to it. But in the end, I feel like, it's very funny. I still hear people that I'm close to. Ian said it the other day. He said, startup ecosystem. And it's one of the challenges of, frankly, the mushiness of these words.
I think go ahead. I'm sorry to step on.
I was going to say, for me, that such an important word is communities. And it's so important at every level. And it's frankly what I think is so powerful about Colorado as a state, because people engage from a perspective of community with each other. They care about being Coloradans. They care about being in Colorado, not just with entrepreneurs, but across the whole state. And reinforcing that message as that nucleus is important.
I'm going to come back to that community aspect as it relates to trust and cooperation, especially as what we see in the pandemic. But I first want to talk about, so you define startup community as well as entrepreneurial ecosystem, talked about the purpose of the startup community is to support and benefit the entrepreneur. The main thesis of the book is that startup communities are complex adaptive systems, and use complex systems for shorthand. You and Ian write that this is a system exists where a set of individual entities connect in such a way that they create a collective pattern of behavior over time, and that a system becomes complex when there are many such entities with varying individual and collective motivations and a seemingly infinite number of connections and subsystems. When you think about that conception of a system and a complex system, explain how an entrepreneurial scene or a startup community fits the concept of a complex system.
Let me start by a 60-second definition. My guess is, Brad, you have a bunch more questions, and I'm giving you like 15-minute answers, so I'll give faster answers now. Here's the definition. There's 3 types of systems that are interesting to us. There's a 4th type of system that we left out. 3 types of systems are simple, complicated, complex. A simple system is making a cup of coffee. You put beans out, you run a recipe, you get coffee. Might not be good coffee. You can change the inputs, you can put sugar in, you can use different beans, you might have a different machine, but it's got a deterministic outcome. A complicated system is doing your monthly financial statements as a business. You start with a bunch of different inputs. You might have to process them in different orders, but the output is an income statement, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement. It's deterministic, and that's your monthly financial statement. It's more complicated, but it's still deterministic. A complex system is raising a child. We've all been children, or we all have children. And if when the child is born, the parents say, when you're 25 years old, you're going to go to CU Law School, you're going to have this kind of a partner, you're going to like this kind of food, you're going to like this sport, you're going to wear your hair this way, This is the sports teams you're going to like. Like all you're doing is setting that kid up for lots of therapy, right? It's just not deterministic. And the things that you do, the inputs generate outputs, which generate new phenomena. And as we were starting to play around with this, if you don't know the language of complexity theory, it's fascinating. We didn't try to make this book a thing to teach people about what complexity theory was. Instead, we tried to use language from complexity theory to help explain how startup communities grow, develop, and evolve. Here's some language. Nonlinear systems. So as human beings, we have a really, really hard time with nonlinear systems that grow on a geometric curve. We're very used to linear systems. Economists, by the way, in some ways are the worst. They extrapolate everything linearly from current information. And subsequently, as you go further out in time, everything's totally wrong. But we do this over and over again. And even people who think they understand geometric curves, for example, don't extrapolate correctly because they think, for example, stock prices will always go up. So therefore I should just buy more stocks until they don't. So this idea of an endless geometric curve in innovation and startup communities doesn't work. Another word is contagion. A year ago, we probably wouldn't talk that much about contagion. You can have positive contagion, negative contagion. Contagion generates feedback loops. Those feedback loops, which accelerate behavior, often have delays in them. So let's use COVID as an example. When COVID starts ramping up again, people say, oh, there's not that many cases happening. What's the big deal? Except for COVID functions as a nonlinear curve if the R naught is greater than, or the R sub n is greater than 1, which if you watch Jared's press briefings, you now know. When it gets above 1, you start to have geometric behavior growth, which that geometric behavior accelerates. Well, okay, more people are getting COVID now in the second wave, but people aren't dying. There's a delay. Just because more people are getting COVID, by the way, that's just testing of the people getting COVID. The delay is how many people are ending up in the hospital and then how many people die. And that may be a delay of 2 weeks or 4 weeks. I had somebody tell me, I can't remember when, it was the beginning of June. Somebody said, well, you know, the lockdown, whenever we stopped the stay-at-home order, about 2 weeks later, somebody said, a very smart friend of mine said, you know, what's going on? Like, you know, it doesn't look like like we got it. The outbreak's not coming back. I said, it's been 2 weeks. The incubation period of this thing is 2 weeks. Give it 2 more weeks. And, you know, sure enough, 2 more weeks, you know, and then the conversation was, well, not that many people, you know, you get what I'm saying. So this kind of language is part of it. Most profound phrase is a phase shift. And I'm going to give you an example of a phase shift in Boulder. A phase shift happens when things look a certain way for a while, and then something happens and they're suddenly different. Okay, so all these words I just gave you, lots more examples in the book and lots more explanation. The phase shift that occurred in Boulder was when I wrote Startup Communities in 2012, and it, Techstars was expanding, Startup Weekend was happening everywhere. I was noisy. I made a lot of noise about the book. I wrote about the book a lot. Lots of people in lots of places other than Silicon Valley wanted me to talk about it. So I talked about it a lot. The message that would come back to me from some people, especially people in larger cities, Bay Area, a little Boston, a little New York, they would say, Boulder is cute. Hey, Brad, Boulder is cute, but it's too small to really support significant companies. And I'd say, yeah, it's 100,000 people, but it's not too small to support significant companies. Well, what are some really significant companies that came out of Boulder? And there'd always be have a defensive conversation. And then in 12 months between 2013 and 2014, Zayo went public. They just got taken private for $14 billion. Rally Software went public. They got bought by Computer Associates a couple of years later. Datalogics got bought by Oracle for $1.2 billion when $1.2 billion was a huge acquisition. And after that happened, nobody said to me anymore, Boulder is cute, right? The phase shift had occurred.
It comes to mind that that's also what Techstars come into its prime as well, which, is in terms of influence within the innovation and entrepreneurship?
Everything looked a certain way, and then suddenly it looked different. And it was very palpable for anybody that has been involved in the startup community, from 2010, to 2015. There was a moment, I don't know the day, right? But there was a moment where all of a sudden the discussion changed very significantly.
So, by the way, I love that stretch of the book when you guys distinguish between simple, complicated, and complex systems. If we distinguish between starting or kickstarting a startup community in the first instance versus the adaptation of a startup community that already exists, do you believe that complex systems thinking applies to both the initial kickstarting of a startup scene as well as the adaptation? Or do you view those as different situations,
No.
maybe the initial startup as a simple system?
No, they're completely linked. The interesting thing, at the beginning of the development of a startup community is that it's kind of an illogical phrase when you really think hard about it. What was the beginning of the Boulder startup community? It certainly wasn't, 2006 when Techstars was started. It certainly wasn't 1995 when I moved to Boulder. It was well before that. And so what you have is this set of initial conditions at any moment in time. 1970, 1995, 2006, 2020. You have a set of initial conditions. And you're not starting with nothing. If you look at a place like Silicon Valley, I have a book that's one of, a fun book to read. It's called 100 Years of Silicon Valley. Or the Renaissance of Silicon Valley, 100 Years of Innovation or something like that. The book was published in 1994. And if you read the book, you see these endless cycles, these endless waves of regeneration because of certain activities. Entrepreneurial recycling would be a big one, right? You have a company, it's successful, it generates wealth, it generates experience, it generates lots of talent. The wealth, experience, and talent has a diaspora. They start companies in that city. It's a company diaspora, not necessarily a physical diaspora. And that generates this positive feedback loop. And you'll have periods of time where there's collapse. The internet bubble would be a good example where there was significant collapse, but you didn't have collapse of everything. You had collapse of elements of what was happening in that complex system. And so again, in the first startup community book, there's a sidebar by Kyle Lefkoff at the very beginning of the book, very deliberately by me, because I did not want to define the book as when I showed up in Boulder, the startup community started.
Everyone knows Kyle was one of the original VCs and behind Boulder Ventures, who was here.
Kyle had been here for a VC prior to that, but he wasn't one of the original VCs in Boulder. You keep going back further, right?
Yeah.
And that's a useful kind of dynamic. And in fact, if you said, well, was he here at the very beginning of the entrepreneurial cycle in Boulder? The answer is no, that goes back even further. So I wasn't trying to document a history. I was trying to shift away from this notion that there is a moment in time that things start. And so that's powerful because I have this in all over the world. I show up in a place, or now virtually, and people say, how do we get started? By the way, in 2020 in the United States, I don't get that question anymore, but in 2012, 2013, I got that question a lot. I said, you already started. And well, what should we do? You're already doing it. Right. And it changes the conversation from I need 6 things and I need somebody to give me permission and I need to, it's like, no, you don't need any of that. You just need to go. And then all of those things will have their impacts and interactions. And that's complexity theory.
I want to pick up on that as individuals look to build and or adapt their startup communities and contrast the first book, which is a more elegant and simple sort of prescription, 4 elements of the Boulder thesis, as you use the lens of complexity theory, that can be more sophisticated. It is more nuanced, and you've got 14 guiding principles. It's deep, it's more cautious, it suggests humility to the people who are involved. Talk a little bit about the trade-offs as you compare the simple elegance of here's the Boulder thesis, 4 things, versus here's 14 principles as you think about, building things together.
If you read the 14 principles, what you'll realize, and I'm sure you realize this because it's a leading question, the 14 principles are actually, we could have separated them into the 4 principles of the Boulder thesis with sub-bullets. We chose not to. But all 14 of those principles relate back to the Boulder thesis. The reason we chose not to was, I think the Boulder thesis continues to stand alone, and I want it to continue to stand alone, and as did Ian. And what we wanted to do was give people more texture around the Boulder thesis. There were several criticisms of the first book. Some of the criticisms were ones that I thought were wrong, and still feel is wrong 8 years later. But some of the criticisms were helpful to me in my own thinking. By the way, the ones that were wrong was there was a thread in some academic research that essentially said practitioners can't tell people how this works. It has to come from academic research. And there are different ways of saying that, including, this guy, Brad Feld's an intellectual lightweight. And this thing that he wrote is all anecdotal from his own experience, and it doesn't generalize, which, is not the experience I think that people all around the world have had as practitioners. So there was some of that sort of stuff, it didn't matter to me. The criticism that was valid, though, was in some ways, the Boulder thesis was elegant and provocative. Today, it's obvious. The reason it's obvious is because of the substance of its elegance, right? If I had come up with, here are the 10 things you need to do, it would have been too ponderous. It would have been too complicated. And when you look at it, if you read it in 2012, for people that read the book in 2012, much of the feedback I got from entrepreneurs was, this makes a lot of sense. And, it's really nice to think about it this way. And then as people started to put it into practice, and there was a lot of friction around how to deal with all the different actors, over time, people started to really say, wow, this makes a lot of sense. We got it. People were asking for more. And they were asking for more. Entrepreneurs were asking for more. In some ways, they said, I need a couple more things to put, arrows in my quiver, as a metaphor, when I'm dealing with government or I'm dealing with university. And I need more than examples. I need a couple more principles. So what we tried to do was flesh it out. And then we tried to relate all 14 of those, not as standalone things, and like chapter 1 is number 1 and chapter 2 is number 2, but weave them into the framing of complex adaptive systems. I want to tell a 60-second creating of a book misery for anybody that hasn't written a book. If you've written a book, you're going to totally get this right away. We started working on the book in 2016, really in 2017. We had a final draft done in 2018. We'd written about 40, 50,000 words. When I say final draft, we had a draft done that we felt like it could have been a book. It sucked. I mean, Ian and I were really unhappy. It sucked. We basically sort of made it this: chapter 1, do this; chapter 2, do that. I mean, there was a little setup. Chapter 3, do this; chapter 4, do this. And we had lots of good stuff. But when we read it, we're like, this is the boringest fucking book on planet Earth. This doesn't, people aren't going to stick with this book. We're not breaking any ground here. And we almost quit. We agonized over it for a couple months. And one day Ian came up with the notion that a startup community was a complex adaptive system. Fortunately, I knew enough about complexity theory. It snapped into place right away. That's something to play with. And we started from scratch. Blank sheet of paper, blank Word document, or blank Google Doc, started over. We cut and paste some of the stuff from the book, but we literally just start over. November 2019, we're done. We send out the book to some beta testers. Brad, you were a beta tester. We got feedback, maybe October. So we sent it out to people in September, October. We got feedback back. Good feedback, some positive. a lot of the feedback consistently said people are not going to get past chapter 3. This book it just doesn't grab you. It's not organized in a way to suck you in. Like I slogged my way through it and I learned a lot, but it was too hard. Nobody's going to stick with it. Remember, we finished the book in February. We took the book and we did what a good software developer would do. We completely refactored the book. So we basically broke the book up into 100 ideas. And then we reorganized the entire book, placing those 100 ideas in different order. And we spent a week and we worked on the order to get the order in a flow that we thought was compelling, including the 14 principles, including the sidebars that we had decided to include in the book. Sorry, that was longer than a minute. That was a programmer's minute. But the end result of that thought was that's the book that it ended up. And the reason I think that it works, at least from, I mean, you can decide as a reader whether it works, is you can take any of the 14 principles and they all stand alone. And they're additive versus, again, a recipe. You have to do A and then B and then C. You don't have to do all 14 of them. Just pick any of them and the principle stands alone and then you can apply it to what's going on.
You're talking about the book literally around the world. And the book is one of the coolest things is, you know, stories from Nigeria and Israel and, you know, literally from all corners of the globe. Which of the new principles is playing the best and which of the new principles are you getting the most hostility to?
I haven't gotten much hostility yet. So I think we're still in the part of the response to the book. The people that are responding to the book are people who either are positively inclined, it reinforces their world in some way. You know, they know and like me, so they're going to say nice things instead of nasty things first. Like we're still in that phase. I think the criticism for a book like this either comes right at the beginning because the book was shitty. And like, I think we tested it with enough people and we were comfortable enough with it that we weren't going to get that. I think it's a year from now, 2 years from now is when some of the criticism will come and hopefully it'll be constructive. Because I learned a lot, by the way, in constructive criticism from startup communities, some of which is in the second edition. I fixed a few things and we incorporated some new ideas like adding the notion of an instigator into the leader-feeder dichotomy. There's now 3 leader, feeders, and instigators and sort of changed how that worked. The things that are landing so well with people that just come up over and over again around the world. The first is the 7 capitals.
Let's take a minute and talk about that.
By the way, the startup community entrepreneurial ecosystem thing gets a lot of play. People, especially entrepreneurs, really, it accomplished what we were hoping.
I'll say it from, you know, the perspective of someone at a university. I also find it useful because it explains the incentive differences between those that are core to the startup community and some of the multitude of incentives of like a university as it relates to that startup community. I think it's a totally useful distinction. Anyway, the 7 capitals.
So 7 capitals, you know, everywhere I go around this topic, people say there's, you know, except for a few places, there's not enough capital here. And a while ago, a number of years ago, I figured out they were saying there's not enough money here. And that's not even true. So in the Startup Communities book, as well as in much of the stuff I talk about, I put the burden on entrepreneurs to educate the rich people in their city, of which most cities, not all, not everywhere in the world, but most cities have wealth. Help wealthy people understand the importance of investing in innovation and entrepreneurship as part of the fabric of their city, in the same way they invest in the arts, or they invest in education, or they invest in the environment, or they invest in whatever they invest in. Ian came up with the idea of separating out capital into multiple, and so we started talking about like capital as a broader construct. We started calling money financial capital. And our assertion was, I used to say every city has its natural resources. And if you're trying to build a startup community that's healthy, you start looking for your natural resources and building on them. We decided to label them, instead of natural resources, we label them capital. So you have intellectual capital, you have infrastructure capital, you have network capital, you have cultural capital, you have financial capital, you have multiple different types of capital. And, you know, Boulder has an enormous amount of intellectual capital because of the university and the government and the labs. You know, in the 1950s and 1960s, some decisions were made, I think, that had huge impact on Boulder. And if those decisions were made, you know, on, to locate that activity in Carbondale instead of Boulder, Boulder would look very different and Carbondale would look very different. And so there are these things that happen that are different types of capital. And it's not to say that financial capital isn't important, but it's just one of these 7. And then going to this notion of focusing on putting energy into the capital that you have to attract the capital that you don't have. The mistake so many actors, especially governments, make, and many entrepreneurs and investors make, is they focus on the capital they don't have in their city, and they put all their energy into trying to get that versus leveraging and amplifying and extending the capital that already exists. So that piece has resonated really well. People are understanding this notion better, and are starting to do some of these things where they're like, oh, we hadn't thought of this network capital that we already have between this large company, that's been here for a long time, the university, the large companies, educational philanthropic activities in conjunction with the university, and the way that we could funnel that into new entrepreneurial activity. We hadn't thought of that as not just a thing to generate new businesses, but as something that could attract capital, because we have that. So by amplifying that and having people understand that we have that, that'll attract more capital. Or, wow, it hadn't occurred to us that somebody who grew up here or somebody that went to school here is motivated, is now a very wealthy entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, but is very wealthy, very, very motivated to put some money back into trying to stimulate a startup community in this geography. There's a good example of this in Portland, Maine, that David Rue and his wife are doing. He was a founder of Silver Lake, very, very, very successful venture capital private equity firm. He's been incredibly successful in his career. He grew up in Portland, and he's done a partnership called the Rue Institute with Boston University. And BU now has a Portland, Maine campus. It's been funded, and the focus of that campus is to be an innovation and entrepreneurial research campus that's part of the Boston University system, right? So again, that's network capital. That's not, I found financial capital. It's I figured out how to use the network capital in my geography. Go ahead, ask a question.
I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to invite those that are on the call to, if you've got questions, please use the Q&A and we will open it up after this. I want to build on this idea of capital. It's not one of the 7 capitals, but I think it's definitely implicit in network capital among others. Robert Putnam has a term social capital, which you allude to in your book, which relates to ultimately trust within different communities. And Putnam in Bowling Alone, and he's got a new book out called, what is the new book? Called The Upswing. Putnam sort of despairs about the decline in social capital since 1960 in the United States across a number of domains, churches, engagement, civic activities, et cetera. Since the pandemic, especially here in Colorado, such an interesting example of how social capital in the startup community has played out as part of the response. You got the citizen engineers team, you got the innovation response team, you've got multiple people from the startup community who have mobilized in different ways as part of the pandemic response. My question to you, Brad, is what lessons, if a politician came to you or a policymaker and said, at this time in which social capital is going down in so many dimensions of society, we see a rise in startup community social trust. What lessons should we be learning for outside of startup communities?
A couple. One is most, not all, but most activities in a geography that are having to do with social capital or network capital, they're not exactly the same, but they're very close cousins. So I think you can use them as replacements for each other if you want. Are positive sum games, and the notion of a positive sum game is so important. In the first book, I called them non-zero sum games. I have no idea why I fucked that up. Like, I don't know why in my head I was so stuck on making the negative to a zero sum game versus transforming it to a positive sum game. I've subsequently fixed that. And if you think about a startup community, it's the essence of a positive sum game. It's a small part of the whole landscape. And people, if they focus on their connectivity to each other, they can accomplish great things that move stuff forward. If you think about society today, so much of our activity in society functions as a zero-sum game. There's a winner and a loser. And part of it is we're conditioned by things like politics, where there's a winner and a loser. Some of it is sports. There's a winner and a loser. I guess you can tie in soccer, you can tie in hockey, but at the end of the season, there's a winner and a loser. Those are zero-sum games. We're so conditioned that so much of what we have to do is focus on I win, you lose, versus we both win. And there was business language when I was in business school in the 80s about win-win and win-win negotiation. Roger Fry wrote a book called Getting to Yes, and sort of that was such a seminal book at the moment in time around this notion of a positive sum game where both parties can win. We see it, by the way, in technology very broadly, where part of the thing that creates massive success of companies is not win-lose competition on all vectors. There may be some vectors where there's win-lose competition, but there's plenty where companies collaborate in a way where they both improve their standing. I think that is at the essence of change in cities and states. And I think we were lucky in Colorado, because in Colorado, we already, even though we have a very, politically divided state, like we were purple before purple was a thing, right? We were a state that was both progressive and conservative, liberal and conservative. People had different orientations, but they didn't hate each other. They didn't view themselves as adversaries. They viewed themselves as Coloradans. And I think you're seeing more and more leaders in Colorado. I mean, I think we're the largest percentage of independent registered voters in any state. Like the number of independents in Colorado are now greater than Democrats or Republicans. Like this is an example of a different kind of thinking where it's like, you know what? We may have different perspectives on things, but we want our city, we want our state, we want our community to be healthier. I think we saw this in a big way in the pandemic response in Colorado, not just within business, but across many, many different dimensions, where the phrase that Eric Matisse came up with that we use at Energize Colorado as a mantra, which I love, is Coloradans helping Coloradans. We, whatever the cliche is, we are all in this together. Embrace that rather than whatever this sort of, I have to win at your expense dynamic that has emerged so broadly, not just in the last 4 years, but in the last phase of, our species in lots of parts of the world, but really especially in this country. Again, I feel really fortunate to be a Coloradan because I don't think it has overwhelmed us here. And I'm optimistic, by the way, about the future, because I think the shock from something like the COVID crisis reminds people that we can be in it together, and we don't have to be the same religion. We don't have to be the same race. We don't have to be the same sex. We don't have to be the same age. The Pope today said that homosexuals were welcome in the Catholic Church. Like, that's a fantastic example of progress, independent of sexual orientation, religion, et cetera. It's sort of, as a species, this continual sense that, you know what, we're humans. And that's what I would tell the politician.
It's a really, we're going to move into the questions from the group here in a second, but I just want to underscore, it's a really interesting idea. And starting where, going back to the start of this discussion, the interaction between Anno's ideas and you and Ian taking the baton from that is a really interesting example of this. It's not, one is better than the other. It's we build on each other's ideas along the way. All right, we've got the WISER rule in effect. First question goes to the student. Student Sarah Keller asks, in your blog, you discuss the importance of mindfulness and meditation. Could you talk more about these topics, and especially someone pursuing a new career or business venture might benefit from practicing mindfulness and or meditation on a regular basis?
Yeah, so I've been very open about my own struggles with anxiety and depression, and one of my one of my goals for the rest of my life is to eliminate the stigma associated with mental health. And a big part of that is going deep on oneself and understanding oneself in the context of all the things about you. We're all flawed human beings. We all have challenges. We all have behaviors. We have programming from childhood. We have brain chemistry, many, many, many different types of dynamics. For me, in a business context and in a place where there's an enormous amount of continual stress from lots of different things that are happening, good and bad, I've found that having a meditation practice, keyword practice, I'm not trying to get a grade, I'm not trying to get good at it, but building in this notion of, which in the Western world, I think mindfulness is a proxy for it, building that into my daily routine, experimenting with it and learning how to use it in a way and how to incorporate it in a way that changes my brain plasticity, changes my way of reacting to things, has been very powerful for me. It's been very powerful for many colleagues and friends and other leaders that I know. The last 3 or 4 years, I've gone very deep on the philosophy of Buddhism, not the religion or spirituality around it, and sort of the notion of how our minds work from a couple of different perspectives. And I come back to over and over again this idea that we don't understand it and that it doesn't actually have meaning until we give it meaning. And part of the dynamics of incorporating things, and I don't care whether it's mindfulness or exercise or sleep, all of which, by the way, I incorporate into different things, but the sort of playing with these things to try to make you a better you is very powerful. And I can spend many hours in conversation around how it's impacted me. I would never be prescriptive to others about what to do. It would be meta, which is spend time on planet you and go deep on planet you to learn about what you want and what matters to you and how you interact with others and yourself in a way that is more rewarding for you rather than inhibiting or self-destructive or problematic or stressful or anxiety producing or whatever.
Next question is from Courtney, who what would you say is the impact of the federal immigration bans on American startup communities? So connecting up American immigration policy as it relates to startup communities.
Well, I think people that know me know that I've been a long time advocate for something that I helped create called the Startup Visa, which first emerged in 2010, still has not passed into law, although there's some interesting hacks around it that CU has also been very supportive of. I believe that legal immigration is an incredibly powerful and important part of the US and an extremely important part of innovation. And if you look at innovation entrepreneurship historically, that has been foundational. I think the last 4 years have been abhorrent. I think the Trump administration's policies around immigration, in addition to being stupid and ham-handed and regressive, actually are accomplishing in a lot of ways the inverse of the goal. And it's especially true in this moment where mobility of people has been frozen for a period of time because of COVID and is causing companies to get very, very comfortable with distributed and remote work. It would have been a moment in time in the absence of that where people would be fighting against this still to try to figure it out. And I think at this moment, many, many, many companies, entrepreneurial companies, large companies are saying basically the equivalent of fuck it. And we hope that in the future, the US immigration policy is more clear, more permissive to people who are interested in being in the United States, who are going to add to our society in a meaningful way, university students who graduate, da-da-da-da. But you know what? I can have people all over the world because we're already operating remotely, because people are already working out of their houses. So we're just going to change our business motion and struggle with it in a different way. It's been fascinating to me, last comment on this, I'm an investor in a company called Boundless, which is a Seattle-based company that is very focused on reducing friction for innovation for individuals. An incredibly successful company from startup 3 years ago, just did a large acquisition of another company. It's grown very, very quickly. Even with what I would sort of kindly say the insanity of the anti-immigration dynamics we've had in the US for the last 4 years, there continues to be incredible need for people who want, incredible demand from people who want to be in the US or are already in the US to stay in the US, because we're viewed as a country that is incredibly attractive to people to build a new life against wherever they came from. That is so foundational in innovation going back 100 years. And I think we're going to have a wave where, it used to be that 80% of the venture capital in the world was in the US, 40% is in the US, 40% is in China, 20% is everywhere else. Guess what? People can start businesses anywhere they want in the world. They don't have to come to the US anymore. And by making it harder or less attractive for people to come to the US and start new companies is just inhibiting the socioeconomic growth of the country.
Andrew?
Not that I have a strong opinion about
it. Andrew says, you mentioned earlier about the acceleration of telework fitting 5 years of progress into 6 months. How does that impact the 7 capitals, especially networking and social capitals?
Well, hang on one second. It's a fun question, and it's a question that I have not yet fully processed. I think I'm trying to do 2 things, and so I'm not going to answer the question with a definitive answer. I'm going to answer the question with the things I'm trying to do. One is I have just assumed that I am now in 2025. So we have accelerated 5 years. It's 2025. And so I'm no longer hanging on to January 2020 in terms of so many things that we do. And by the way, in 2025, I'll be 60. So I'm also using that frame of reference of where I am in my life. I would encourage people to not try to hold on to the idea that we're going back to January 2020. Ain't gonna happen. I would encourage people to get rid of the phrase new normal. Doesn't mean anything. Understand that the technology curve that we've been on and a bunch of societal structures, including a bunch of incumbencies that existed, we've accelerated things that were evolving 5 years in 6 or 7 months. And we're now trying to resort how all those things work. And we don't know how they all work. That's why I can't answer the question very clearly. It'll take some time to resort it, but that's where we're living. So that's thing one, is try to get that mindset. We're going to see way more incumbent infrastructure that has been holding back change in our society, some good, some bad, collapse before this is over. Not sort of modify itself a little bit, vanish from the face of the earth, collapse into rubble. And there's already a bunch that we're in the midst of or that we know about. Thing two, I'm trying to envision myself in 2040. I think the technology that we have today has been amazing and transformative, and the curve we've been on since the commercialization of the internet in 1995, or the sort of beginning of the commercial internet in 1994, 1995 has been incredible. And not just software, but software and hardware. However, when I look at it from the perspective of where it could be and should be, and what people are spending their time on and how we work, I think we are so far from what we're going to see 20 years from now. The world does not need a better note-taking app. We don't need another better way to message each other. We don't need yet another way to organize data. We need a completely different way of interacting with all this stuff, and this stuff interacting with us. And we've had a taste of it with video conferencing. But you know what? Zoom is no different than WebEx 20 years ago. I mean, it's better. It's more performant. I can see the pimple on the end. Your nose is a little shiny. You need a little, we can do breakout rooms better. The software is easier to get started. But we're still talking to each other through two-dimensional screens with little boxes on the screen in ways that are exhausting. By the way, as I have to get off, I'll give everybody their Zoom tip of the day. If you spend a lot of time on Zoom, turn off self-view. Do not have yourself in a window on Zoom all day long. If you want to understand why that's bad for you, put a mirror next to your desk that's staring at you and stare at the mirror all day long. It makes you exhausted in a whole nother level because you're constantly looking at yourself versus engaging with what's going on. Like it's easy, things like that our technology is not helping us with. And by the way, there's way more. That's your Zoom tip. There's like a whole long list of insane making things that when I think about what 2040 is going to be like, many of these things are going to be completely different in terms of how we approach it. I encourage people to run those thought experiments sort of regularly in the context of trying to get the answer to the question you just asked, which is how things are going to be different.
Brad, we are bumping up against the end of the hour. A couple of things in closing. One is to your point about things that structures, infrastructures, and legacy structures that may be collapsing soon. Thomas Friedman has a dynamite piece in the New York Times yesterday that I'll recommend to people. Second is the book is Startup Communities. Congratulations, Brad, to you and Ian on this book, and thank you for a very rich discussion. Want to again thank Silicon Valley Bank and Josh Dorsey for buying some of the books for students. And we are going to move into Air Meets. Vanessa, how do people jump into Air Meets? What do they do?
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brad. This was always fun to hang out with my namesake. And everyone that hung in through the whole thing, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for being here, and hope everybody's healthy and safe, especially with all the fires. So take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, take care of your neighbors. We're all in this together.
Thank you, Brad.